While it has long been recognized that Southern slave owners were in the minority and that they were by no means a homogeneous group, so much of what scholars know about women in the slaveholding South draws upon the diaries or letters of the most elite, those living in households that owned more than 10 enslaved people. Historians have chronicled these lives, producing microhistories about an extremely small subset of an already small group of white Southerners. Such studies should not be used to make generalizations about the majority of women in slaveholding communities at large. Records indicate that the majority of slave owners owned 10 enslaved people or less. Scholars who examine the authority that women held over their slaves frequently focus on the women's obligatory rather than voluntary or self-initiated management and discipline of enslaved people. They argue that women could not be true masters of slaves, rather they were fictive masters. Even when they possessed the skills and the gall to manage their slaves, these historians argue, they typically did not relish their power. They did not view their activities as slave mastery, and neither did Southern laws and courts. This was especially true when it came to violent forms of discipline. White women might punish enslaved people. They might even be brutal and sadistic, but they fell short of wielding a master's power. In sum, these scholars argue that slave-owning women's acts of violence differed from those of slave-owning men. By extension, many of these scholars flatly reject the idea that white married women could adeptly manage enslaved people without the assistance of men, be they white or black, or that, aside from a few exceptional women, they could possess the acumen to do so while also effectively running plantations. Married women, they argue, begrudgingly assumed roles as deputy husbands and fictive widows when their husbands were away. When their men were present, these women happily and enthusiastically relinquished such responsibilities and exhorted their men to handle what one historian has called a man's business. And in the view of more than a few historians of American slavery and the domestic slave trade, this was especially the case when it came to the business of buying, selling, and even hiring enslaved people. These scholars claim that the nasty and unseemly business of transacting for human beings was considered ill-suited to white ladies. In They Were Her Property, I build upon these earlier studies, but I also depart from them in significant ways. I focus specifically on women who owned enslaved people in their own right, and in particular on the experiences of married slave-owning women. In addition, I understand these women's fundamental relationship to slavery as a relation of property, a relation that was, above all, economic at its foundation. I am not suggesting that this was these women's only relationship to the institution, or that the economic dimension of their relations overrode other aspects of their connections to slavery. Rather, I argue that pecuniary ties formed one of slave-owning women's primary relations to African American bondage.